I'm looking at a landscape. Everybody who comes here loves this landscape and they see it as pastoral and peaceful. Well, I see it rather different than that because I can see the work that's gone into it over the centuries. I can see hedges that have been planted, ditches that have been dug and drains that have been laid, woodlands that have been planted and managed, and that work locks onto the seasons and is really hard grind for centuries and centuries, and that's what's made the landscape look the way it looks now. It's not in the least bit natural, it's actually man-made, it's agriculture. I'd given up any expectation of having an artistic life when I left school, but then I got quite surprised when I retired and wanted to manage some land, but it turned out that I could be creative in it too, because I discovered that the materials I was exposed to on a day-to-day basis had properties that were interesting and they changed over time, and it all led one thing to another in terms of showing an aesthetic outcome from just processing the materials that I found every day: hedge laying, coppicing, making charcoal, just making piles of wood. All these pieces are extraordinary shapes that I couldn't use when I was laying the hedge. So these are all crabapple. I've cut them down the edge to give this lovely platform that I'm going to use with some charring and scarring, and the whole piece will be an assembly that's hanging from a footbridge down in Lyme, Regis. And this is my cut and warp column piece, which is a David Nash experiment, really. And he's experimenting with repetitive chainsaw cuts, allowing the weather to get to it and start opening up cracks. You can even hear it crack sometimes. And that's just a wonderful animation of a piece of wood by David Nash that I've tended to copy. And then I charred it as well to hint at what was coming later on. As I try and draw out of that material lots of its structural features, and scarring it with the chainsaw, charring it in places does that for me because it accentuates the structural fibres in the wood by putting texture into it. Sometimes I just use burning wood to char it, sometimes I use a blowtorch, and in this case what I use is a branding iron, and it turns out to be a piece of an old farming equipment that's broken off and been left in someone's hedge. It was used to make hay. They break off frequently and they get discarded, and I just love them because they give me a shape that reminds me of the work that goes into the farmland, and I can use that as a branding iron on my work. So what I like about the materials I work with is that they're natural, they have a natural structure. I try and bring out some of the features of the structure. If it starts to crack, I like that. If it's got knots, features that are part of its history, I like to expose those. And this piece is called Hillside. This came from some tree surgery which cleared the woodland above some coppicing I'd done, so that was done specifically to bring light into the hazel to make that regenerate. I cut all the limbs down lengthwise because I wanted to enjoy the shape that came from that, and then the surface I cut into it with the chainsaw to bring out the fibrous structure of it, and then I set forward some of it to give you a different depth of texture, and I even embellished it with a few footprints of animals and other works such as the circle of a charcoal kiln, so there's a bit of reflecting what happens to the landscape to make it. A sweet chestnut plank that I've seen the shape and wanted to do something which exploits that pointy end. There's another scarring and charring piece, but this time I've introduced some lead. The lead was recovered from farm buildings that were being renovated and converted, so it was discarded lead that I've melted and hammered into place in that groove.
actually water runs down there in the rain, and it brings with it all the tannin from the wood, so that's where the browning comes from. And that's what makes it the piece it is. It's called porine. So I'd lay a stem, it would go into a position where it seemed to want to go, and all that aesthetic feedback I was getting from the hedge laying made me think that actually it's an art form, not a craft, and I've explored from that. I've developed all the processes I have to do the work that's hedge laying and turned it into an art practice. It's a willow tree, and normally speaking I wouldn't leave any willow in a hedge. It's a good habitat though for wildlife, so on this occasion I've decided to ring bark it so it doesn't carry on living above ground level, and then above in the top of the tree I've peeled off all the bark and drilled some holes and made habitat for bees and other insects, butterflies, bats even, so we'll see what happens.